All right, well, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to day 3 of the CNU Florida Summit. I hope you had some time earlier today to take the virtual tours of both Florida State University campus as well as the Florida A&M campus. In a moment, we're going to hear from Dr. Jillian Volpe White and Mark Bertolami on reflective spaces. It is with great pleasure that I bring these speakers to you and that we get to share in the conversation. Both Dr. Volpe White and Mark Bertolami are very special people to me. And so I'm really excited about this session. We'll end the summit today with a interactive networking session that will begin at 5:45. For anyone who was able to attend the CNU Summit, National Summit in Louisville in 2019, you might remember a plenary session on compassionate cities and what it means to be a compassionate city, and whether this is something that can be built into the ethos and design of our communities. Through this next session, I hope that you think about the importance of reflection and whether that is something that can be built into the ethos and design of our communities as well. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Jillian Volpe White, the Director of Strategic Planning and Assessment in the Office of the Vice President of Student Affairs at Florida State University, and Mark Bertolami, the Director of Facilities Planning and Space Management at Florida State University.
Great, thanks so much. Well, good afternoon, everyone. We are excited to talk with you all. And we elected this format specifically because we have a couple of interactive pieces. And so at different points, we'll probably ask you to put some things in the chat and engage with us a little bit. So here's a sense of where we're going. We are first going to contextualize reflection and get on the same page about what do we mean when we say reflection. And then Mark is going to talk about the FSU Master Plan and how we plan for reflective spaces. And then we'll give a sort of a case study of how we were able to plan together with the team for the FSU Labyrinth, and then some lessons we learned about reflective spaces. So to start, we'd love for folks to drop in the chat. What comes to mind when you hear the word reflection? Maybe take a minute to consider it, and then just let us know what comes to mind when you hear reflection. Natural environment, looking back. So seeing some things that are both places that folks might consider reflective and the types of things you do when reflecting. Literal reflection. Something rare in modern life. We'll talk a little bit about that. So you all have got a lot of the similar ideas to what we're going to talk about. And I like this photo to always start a conversation about reflection because it symbolizes reflection for me in 3 ways. So it is literal reflection. You can see what is on the sky reflected in the water. You can think back. So for me, I think back to when was this photo taken? Who was I with? How am I a different person than I was when this picture was taken? And then I like it because it's a photo. And so I think about if all of us were somewhere together in a conference space, on a beach, wherever, and we all took a picture of the exact same thing, they would be similar, but they wouldn't be identical. They would be just a little bit different, such that when we put them together, we have a better sense of the whole, which speaks for me to the power of our collective reflection and not just our individual thought processes, but how we come together. So I want to frame reflection. I won't call this a definition because there are so many hundreds of definitions and frames for reflection, but I'll give a sense of what my colleagues and I consider some structures for reflection and leadership, which is the area that we study. And so the first is that reflection is both cognitive and affective. It is what we think and what we feel. Then often reflection is catalyzed by something that causes us to feel uncertain or perplexed. And so We often talk about how we don't necessarily reflect on good things or what is going well, but we think about, why did that meeting feel awkward? What was it about that day that I didn't enjoy? What do I want to reconsider going forward? Ideally, reflection is ongoing and consistent, so it's something that happens as a cyclical process. And often it's supported by guidance or mentorship or coaching, so someone asking you questions, someone that you're talking with. And perhaps most importantly, it facilitates storytelling. And when I frame this to students, I often tell them, think of it like two resumes. And if someone has a resume that's identical to someone else, but they can tell you a really good story about their experience and what they learned, that's different than just having something on paper that tells you their credentials. And so how do you operationalize your experience? So really, to summarize all reflection involves thinking, but not all thinking is necessarily reflective. This picture, or series of pictures, gives a sense of some different activities and means for reflection. And so you can see just 4 examples. The top left would be journaling. The top right would be some kind of movement or exercise, perhaps. The bottom left represents maybe a conversation with a specific person, or being in a place like a coffee shop. And then on the bottom right, some folks from Tallahassee might recognize the Labyrinth at Litchgate on High Road. So we'd love to give folks a minute to just think to yourself about, how do you reflect? Who do you reflect with? Where do you prefer to go when you're feeling a need for a reflective moment? Maybe what do you do for reflection? So take a moment to think about the how, the where, the with whom of your reflection. And once you all have something in mind, again, we'd love for folks to drop something in the chat and maybe share with other folks what came to mind when you think about how you reflect. Looking at the water. I agree with already, coffee, a great reflective beverage. I see nature. I see nature alone. So a lot of this is resonating with things that I hear, although I might expect to hear some more like walking and outdoors types of activities, specifically from this group. Anything else that hasn't come up yet that folks thought of? Long walks. I don't know about folks on the call, but I've definitely been doing a lot more walking and thinking in the last 6 months for sure. Yes, the shower. People often mention the shower. So on this slide, I have a couple of things that have come up over time. I have this conversation frequently with college students, and so some of the things that they say that don't really surprise me are in the car and in the shower. And for me, I think that's because those are some of the places where we can't or shouldn't have our phone, and so we really have to disengage and sort of have some headspace. People mentioned coffee and outdoors. Sometimes folks have a specific place in the woods or a specific beach. We have some walking and some action. Sometimes folks mention a specific person, a colleague. Sometimes people have different people they go to reflect about different things. And then we'll talk a little more about the labyrinth, but maybe some rituals or a creative medium. One thing I didn't see, which is a whole other presentation and conversation, is social media. And so this idea of, is social media a place we go to reflect or perform? But we can save that for, that's a whole other conversation. But appreciate the engagement and the things that folks listed. So in terms of how to reflect, I realized when we were having conversations that we often ask people to reflect, but we don't tell them how. We assume that it's something that's known. And so I like to frame 3 questions. If you remember nothing else to spark a reflective practice, it's the idea of what, so what, and now what. So thinking back, collecting data points essentially about what was the experience, what occurred, then thinking about why it matters, so that interpretive stance, and then, so what do I do with this now? How do I take this into my future goal setting and planning? And I bring this up because as meaning-making creatures, we tend to go straight to the so what. It's easy to skip the what. And especially when you're reflecting with a group of folks, it's important because how I perceive something, we might have a team building exercise and I think it was a great success and Mark thinks maybe I wasn't listening or it didn't go so great, or we just don't know what the other people think until we ask them. And so thinking about what, then so what, then now what. And then finally, I shared this quick piece from the Harvard Business Review. I really appreciate it. It's why you should make time for self-reflection, even if you hate doing it. And so that acknowledgement that reflection can feel like nothing. Sometimes it can feel like we should be doing something more purposeful, or sometimes we just don't want to think about something. It's challenging, it's difficult, we've got a lot on our mind, and so it can be something that we sometimes shy away from. So acknowledging that it can be challenging and time-consuming, and it's still important for that practice of moving forward and taking what we learn and applying it. So hopefully this was a helpful sort of primer on just what is reflection. And now I'm going to shift the conversation over to Mark to talk about the FSU Master Plan and reflective spaces on campus.
Thank you, Jillian. Let's go ahead and hit the next slide. Okay. What you should know, or what everybody should know, is that all state universities in Florida are required to maintain a campus master plan. And we've been doing it here at FSU for about the last 30 years. And recently, this spring, we completed the most recent update of our master plan. I don't have time, obviously, today to go into all the details, but I will say that the notion of reflection did surface on more than one occasion in some of our discussions as we began to look at the future of the university. For those not familiar with FSU or Tallahassee, this is an aerial shot of the main campus here in town. Okay. So as you might expect with most master plans, they contain a lot of broad sweeping planning initiatives, and I will assure you that our master plan contains those. And I've just identified two, just to give you a sense by what I mean by broad and sweeping. On the left is a view of a planned arena district that we have been discussing now for a number of years, that centers around the Tucker Civic Center. And as you might imagine, civic centers can be hubs for a lot of development. And so we're proposing expansions of the College of Business, the College of Law. We're looking at entrepreneurial programs. We're looking at hotel and convention facilities. And so it's a very, very large project, and obviously it will take years to develop, but the ball has started rolling. And then on the right-hand side, you'll see something that we started about 6 or 7 years ago called the Madison Mile. And though you may not recognize the figures at the bottom, what's represented is the football stadium on the left, and then this arena district on the right. And quite coincidentally, it's about a mile. And so what we were looking at is this whole idea of redevelopment, working with private development partners on providing academic and academic supports activities along there. So that's just examples of some of these big ideas that universities love to throw out. But at the same time, master plans also begin to start looking at some of those smaller nuances or nuance planning. And these are just 4 photographs of projects that we've done over the years that begin to call upon this notion of reflection or quiet space. And so they can be public art as shown in the upper left corner. They can be seating areas located between academic buildings. On the lower left, you can see a pavilion that we partnered with a sorority so that they could have an opportunity not only to celebrate their 100th year here on the university, but also create a place for their sorority sisters and pledges to meet. And then on the right-hand corner, it was really a major landscaping initiative that looked at creating an enhanced space with seating in other areas, similar areas where students could either sit on the grass or sit on benches and just have time in between a very busy class schedule. So it goes from, like I said, big planning initiatives to even small efforts such as these. So I want to point out a couple other ones that I really have some specialization to them. One is called the Black Rock, and it literally is that, a black rock. So the Westcott building shown in the left corner, upper left corner, is our main administration building, and there's a historic green just north of that. The yellow star represents an area where we created this small garden area. And we created it because we were approached by a student about 20 years ago who with other of her friends and colleagues were mourning the death of another student. And they noticed that there really wasn't a location on campus to have any kind of either structured or informal ceremonies that you might expect to have when a friend passes away. And so with her colleagues, she raised some money, and we created this space. And on the black rock there is this inscription that's really meant to provide some kind of solace or comfort to people going through that process. What's interesting is that it's used not only for purposes like that, but for just about everything else too, as you might imagine. It's frequent to find students sitting there or faculty sitting there, conversations by themselves, quiet. We've seen some small group activities as well. And it's really turned out, I think, to be one of the really nice garden areas on our campus. If we move ahead, there's another planned, I think, activity that I think is worth mentioning. In the center of campus, we have what's called the Honors and Scholars Building. Now, Google Maps identifies it as Chick-fil-A, and I will tell you there is a Chick-fil-A on the ground floor. But the architects, when we were designing the building, we're beginning to think about how do students pass through or utilize the facility. And so this is a site plan that identifies the building itself there shown in garden, and then some pathways that lead to the building and then through the general area. And so in doing so, they noticed that students really, at least in respect to this project, would think about it in three ways. First of all, students play, or they recreate, or they have activity. They also need places just to pause, like I said, either to rest or to meet somebody. And then they need this rewind space. So this was really the first time where we attempted in the design of a building to start thinking about how users would utilize the building in various aspects of their daily life. And so the two pictures that follow now are examples of those rewind spaces we created with the project. The project or the photo on the left represents just a little shady courtyard with some benches. And coincidentally, when I took this picture, there was a student just sitting there talking on his phone, reading a book, it looked like. The picture on the right is right next door to it in a way, and it's a small amphitheater. And it's very frequent to find students just sitting there. Like I said, there's a Chick-fil-A there, so sometimes they eat there. Sometimes you'll find music students rehearsing in the area, which adds a really nice flavor to the space itself. And so this was, I think, the eye-opening project, at least to a lot of us administrators and architects, that realize that there's a lot more that goes into designing the building than just meeting the basic building requirements. And then another one we wanted to point out, when we designed our health and wellness center, we created this one certain little area. We created a wellness garden or healing garden on the east side of the building. And within that, there's a little seating area with benches and, as you can see, umbrellas. And you may not immediately recognize it, but there's fountains. Those are the three gray boxes coming out of the wall. And so you also get that auditory complement, you get that sound. And so it's really like a little eddy in the midst of a big stream, because right next to it, off screen to our left, is the Woodward Pedestrian Mall, which is a major pedestrian mall. And as you can see in the inscription that's at this location, it says it's a meditative space to encourage your search for meaning, purpose, and authenticity. And it was brought to the university, or it was helped sponsored by a group we call the Spiritual Life Project. And it was a gift from them to their fellow students and for generations to come.
We also wanted to point out the meditation walk. So that same group, the Spiritual Life Project, had started to look around campus and say, where are the reflective spaces? And they created a map that would draw students to those different places for thinking and reflection. And then periodically they would lead reflection and meditation walks around campus and take students to all the places on the map, which includes several of the places Mark mentioned and a few places that are still to come in our conversation. And so we started to see planning was working on some reflective spaces. We had some energy with the Spiritual Life Project and student affairs. And that is what led us to get to work together on our sort of case study for planning for reflective spaces, which is the FSU Labyrinth. So we want to take a minute to explain what is a labyrinth, and maybe would love to hear from folks. Just like drop a yes in the chat. Have you walked a labyrinth before, or are you familiar with what a labyrinth is? I know Artie's walked a labyrinth. Okay, so one person, a couple folks. So I first experienced a labyrinth at a retreat center when I was in high school. They had taped the labyrinth on the floor of the sort of hall we were in with masking tape. But I didn't see like an actual labyrinth in the ground until I went to Litchgate on High Road, which is that picture I showed earlier. And so just to give some context for what a labyrinth is, you can look at this picture of the FSU Labyrinth from above and notice that it is a unicursal path, which means there's one way in and one way out. So when we christened the labyrinth or debuted the labyrinth, we had people repeat after us and say, a labyrinth is not a maze. And so really the distinction is a maze is a puzzle to be solved. It's got multiple possibilities. And a labyrinth is where you go to solve the puzzles in your mind and sort of do some thinking and processing potentially. So labyrinths are 3,500 years old and they've been found on all continents except Antarctica. And so they really are prevalent across the world, sometimes tied to spiritual connections, but not always. So when we started researching labyrinths and reflective spaces, we found there are hundreds of labyrinths across the country, some very ornate, some very simple, but here are 4 examples from universities. So James Madison, University of Maryland, Boston College, and Ohio State. And just maybe notice the different constructions, the different materials, the different formality. So we really notice that labyrinths are all different manifestations on campuses. I've actually been to the one at James Madison. It's lovely. It's tucked up in their arboretum. And if you're ever on their campus, it's a great space to visit. So we also started looking at what are the possibilities and benefits of a labyrinth. Some of these apply to all reflective spaces and some are unique to the experience of walking a labyrinth. But we were reading about people pondering problems, thinking critically, maybe examining their life commitments and plans, inspiring creativity, so maybe walking the labyrinth before a writing project, perhaps walking with others for connection, experiencing gratitude, and what's left off of this slide is also perhaps experiencing grief or mourning someone, reducing stress, and then something that came up a lot in the literature was connecting to the physical self. And so that act of taking a step, acknowledging your footfalls, paying attention to the sensation in your body. And so you'll frequently find labyrinths in hospitals or rehabilitation centers as a way for folks to be mindful and focus on the physical self. So how we got to work together on this project, there was someone at FSU named Laura Osteen, and she had taken, for years, she talked about having a labyrinth on campus, but she'd mentioned it in conversations, we talked about it, but it hadn't had necessarily traction. But in fall 2014, there was a student named Hunter who was taking a class called Leadership and Spirituality, and we talked about labyrinths, and it really just took the student voice to say, what if we had a labyrinth? Could we have a labyrinth on campus? And so that really launched this planning committee In 2015, we were able to acquire a grant for what you see here, which is a portable labyrinth. And so they're actually labyrinth makers. So this one was commissioned by a woman in Minnesota who made a labyrinth. And we would take it to different events on campus. This is at a conference where folks could just go off and have some quiet, reflective time, and started to galvanize support for the process. And so then we started conversations of what if we could really build a labyrinth on campus? And that's where we went to Mark, and our first conversation was, if we could do this, where would we want to have this? How would it fit with the rest of campus? And so we looked across campus at some different reflective spaces. One very, very hot August day, we took a golf cart all around campus and looked at probably a dozen different places before settling on the spot where it was constructed. And I'll let Mark pick up the story there.
Yeah. Actually, I think it was more than a dozen. I think we identified about 20. And it's really, a challenge on this campus because we are a very small campus and yet we have a very large enrollment. And so literally every square inch of campus is usually scrutinized. There is some open space, but we have to think about it judiciously. What we did know is that the Labyrinth wanted to be a relatively flat site. We wanted it to be somewhat secluded, but also visible. So we'll talk later about what safety and security means to when you think about spaces like this. And so we identified really two sites that we thought were optimum that at least deserve consideration. A smaller site on the east side of campus that we're not going to discuss today, but instead we want to show you this site on the west side of campus in an area we call our life sciences complex. And so within this complex, we have the College of Medicine, we have the psychology department, we have biological sciences, and then some interrelated institutes. And when this space was laid out, and we were fortunate that we were able to develop this entire area within about 3 to 5 years, we wanted to go back maybe 100 years or so to our ancestors on how they designed college campuses. And in doing so, they created this green space or this open space between the buildings. As architects, we like to say that buildings relate to one another, and they relate so by having a comfortable distance. We often say that buildings talk to one another. And so we wanted to create a green or open space amongst these. There's probably about 500,000 square feet represented in these buildings. And so we didn't want to go ahead and put them butt up to next to each other. We wanted to create a little breathing room. In practical terms, that breathing room or that open space is really a future construction site. There will come a time at some point in the university's future when the value of that land, frankly, is worth more as maybe it's an expansion of the College of Medicine, maybe it's another institute, who really knows? And so for the time being, we just simply identified it as green space. And so on this next shot, I think you'll get a picture of what that space looked like before the Labyrinth was developed. It literally was green space, and we encouraged any and everybody to go out and utilize it in whatever shape or form they wanted to. The 3 thumbnail pictures on the right, though, are some landscape improvements we did next to the College of Medicine. These are all images of what we call the healing garden. And in this healing garden, our grounds department identified and planted plants and trees that traditionally have been used in medicine or homeopathic medicine. And so it's a very rich landscape, not only at the College of Medicine, but in all those other buildings that I mentioned too. So we thought having the detailed design of a labyrinth, one that was appropriately designed in such a way that it would fit in to this area would be really a rich improvement to the general area. And so we started with this site. When we started, though, we didn't anticipate a labyrinth as large as the one you're going to see. We actually expected to do something much smaller. And so we were looking for some smaller areas around these buildings where perhaps we could go ahead and design it. And so we worked with our grounds department and some landscape architects in the grounds department. And their first idea was to go ahead and make it larger. And so we don't utilize that entire green space, but we utilize almost 60 or 70%. The rest is used for underground utilities that you really don't want to step on their toes. When we identified the site, we went through the administration, of course, but we also talked to the neighbors. We went to the College of Medicine, we went to the psychology department, and we went to the biology department. We wanted to get buy-in. After all, even though it's technically not their turf, they identify it. And we received overwhelming positive response when we posed the question, hey, what would you think if we were to go ahead and put a labyrinth on this green space? It was so well received, in fact, that the College of Medicine used it on a photo of one of their magazines. And so we're really pleased that they thought so much of it that they went ahead and utilized it in this way. So what does it really take then to go ahead and build a labyrinth? And these are just 4 construction shots taken obviously at various stages of construction. It really is a landscape project by itself, but because we wanted to include power for lighting and water for irrigation, there was some site utility work involved as well. And so these are 4 progress shots that take it through the early stages. We started the work in May and we finished, Jillian, I think in around September, August, September?
We had the opening in November, but I think it was finished before then.
Right. And so it takes about 4 months. It was really intriguing because I was approached by several of my colleagues in the building and then people who saw this strange project going in. And when I mentioned the labyrinth, their first reaction, unfortunately, was, oh, it's a maze. But at the same time, once they understood what the purpose of the project was, they became really intrigued. And as we approached completion, more and more of them said, hey, when are we going to use it? When are we going to use it? There was a real anticipation about its opening. And so we want to go to the next picture. This then is the final, or a picture taken, if not at, but very close to the final completion date. You can tell by the landscaping, it's not fully installed yet, and it's not nearly as grown as you saw in the earlier picture. But what we wanted to do was to, and there's a better shot, and this begins to highlight some other lessons we learned about labyrinth design in general. Jillian, you want to go ahead and pick up a few? Or can we go back to, let me just go, oh, okay, go ahead. I'm sorry.
So I love the picture of the finished labyrinth grown in. I got a chance to go by and see it this summer. But we wanted to share some thoughts about what we learned that we think this is the part that maybe could apply to other reflective or future spaces. So the initial concern was we wanted to make sure it was safe, accessible, and comfortable. And so in terms of safety, we know college students are 24/7 creatures. We thought someone might be out here when they're cramming for a test at 2 a.m. and they come across the street from Sally Hall, or we just wanted to make sure that at all hours it felt secluded enough to be reflective, but open enough that it would be safe. And so I learned a lot about construction in this process. What you see in the top left corner are what are called bollards. And so these were really unique lights that made sure the space was well lit, but also it wasn't sort of like a glaring overhead street light. So we really focused on the safety aspect and then also accessibility. So the top right picture shows you how wide the path is, sort of the scale. And so most labyrinths have a very narrow path because the idea is that it focuses your footfalls and helps you direct your attention. But we really wanted this to be fully ADA accessible. And so there are 3-foot wide sidewalks and periodic 5-foot turning pads with 5-foot radius. And so we felt like we could achieve the focus with the landscaping and the sense of place and also make it fully accessible. To that end, we also have, you'll see in the bottom right, some guidelines for how one might walk a labyrinth, and that's on one of the pillars in the entryway. We also have the guidelines in Braille. And then on the opposite pillar, there is a tactile labyrinth. So if someone couldn't experience the labyrinth by walking or using another mobility device, they could trace the labyrinth with their finger and have a similar meditative experience.
So another thing we've learned is that reflective spaces can be either elegant or very simple. And here are 2 examples that define that. On the left is the reading room from the university's first library in Dodd Hall. It's now used as a museum. And it's very ornate. You can just tell by the styling of the architecture. It's a very formal space, and yet somebody can go in there and sit at a table or simply walk along the perimeter or just stand in there and experience that feeling of reflection. On the other hand, nearby is a sycamore tree with a concrete bench underneath. And so one of the things we've learned is you can either spend a lot of money, you can go to a lot of formality, or you can do something as simple, as long as it's appropriate, you can go ahead and do something as simple as putting a concrete bench under a tree. That can be equally as effective for someone than going inside a more formal space. We also learned that labyrinths, or reflective spaces really, can be commemorative or not. And so this is an example of a commemorative space that our Master Craftsman program created a couple of years ago near the College of Criminology. It's a memorial to honor the service of fallen law enforcement officers, especially those that have graduated from Florida State. And here you'll see a photograph on the right of a ceremony when it was unveiled. And so for people who want to go ahead and perhaps revisit that memorial, or perhaps the memory of a friend, colleague, or loved one, we can, again, formalize that around a specific commemorative event, or not, as you can remember from the bench under the tree. They can be programmed, they can be thought of, they can be designed, they can be redesigned, or they can be very impromptu. So the two images on the left are some recent renderings of our new student union. And the picture on the bottom begins to represent some of those outdoor spaces. And again, putting those seating areas, putting those impromptu areas, putting those spaces in there that students or faculty and staff can use to either have reflection or small group discussions are very, very important to the success of that building. On the other hand, on the other side of campus, a student who had a hammock decided to go ahead and string it up between two pine trees. And that student was there for at least the hour that I was at a meeting nearby. I saw him when I walked in, and he was sitting there. And as I walked out about an hour later, he was still sitting in the tree. And so for him, that little cathedral of pine trees right there was everything he needed to have that timeout space, or that reflective space, or that contemplative space where he, for all intents and purposes, was alone with himself in the world.
So similarly, we thought about the idea of permanence when it comes to a labyrinth. And so Mark mentioned that the space that our current labyrinth is on may not always be a labyrinth, but a lot of the pieces that created the labyrinth can be picked up and moved somewhere else potentially. I saw someone put in the chat that they walked a labyrinth in a French cathedral, and I don't know if it was this one, but this is one of the most famous labyrinths in the Chartres Cathedral. Very old, very elaborate, and perhaps at quite a high cost, and very permanent. Whereas this labyrinth is in my backyard. It was strung up with some twine and pavers, and it is very much not permanent, but something that I can use to walk before writing, or just when it's been a long day, but could easily be picked up and moved somewhere else. Yes, so you did walk that cathedral. It is on my bucket list to go to the Chartres Cathedral and walk the labyrinth for sure. And then finally, we think about something that we learned related to potential for research. And so I'm working with some colleagues in the Leadership Learning Research Center on a project that helps us understand how leadership and reflection support one another. And so what you see here, we had asked students to submit photos of reflective spaces. And what immediately struck me was, one, how many of them were blue and green, just because of nature and water and trees. But also all the other pictures folks submitted of gyms and showers and cars and art making and yoga, and just all the different ways that people conceptualize reflection. And then thinking about how do we take what we know about the student experience to facilitate teaching people how to reflect and providing space where they can't reflect.
And then finally, you know, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of master planning, how, you know, I think we were very fortunate in that we were able to identify a location and the funding and the resources necessary to create a labyrinth. But, you know, I don't know if we'll have another one on campus, but we'll certainly have other reflective spaces. And so in the upper left corner, you'll see the northwest corner of our campus, and it's an area that's ripe for redevelopment. This is just a massing diagram that would illustrate what the potential or the carrying capacity for that property is. It'll be very much mixed use. It'll have student housing, it'll have academic buildings, research buildings, it'll have recreational space, it'll have food service, it will have all the utilities necessary to make it a functional space. And as we look at the campus from 10,000 feet in the air, it's difficult to say exactly where we might create these kinds of spaces, but knowing going into this that we'll be housing approximately 2,000 to 3,000 students that will live in that area eventually, and that there will be close to 1 million square feet of research and academic space. It's not hard to imagine that the need will exist for those kinds of spaces that we talked about today. So as we program the individual improvement, whether it's a residence hall or a physics building or a classroom building, we're going to go ahead and look at those kinds of spaces that sometimes are just forgotten. Sometimes it's just a little nook in a stairway, sometimes, or a landing, I should say, on a stairway. Sometimes it's just a little nook in a lobby. Sometimes it's an outdoor space. And so what we're going to instruct our designers and architects to do is to help us identify where these kinds of spaces can occur and what can be done, usually for very modest costs, to create that kind of space, whether it's an impromptu activity or something even more planned, like classes, exterior classes. It's something we feel that we've learned through this whole experience, that we can add value and richness to our design and our campus planning if we think about all of the activities that a campus population might do during a day, and that includes reflection.
So I think the final thought I have that I was sort of reflecting on over the weekend heading into this presentation is I think what made this a successful process across divisions in the university and bringing together groups of folks who don't typically get to work together is that we started the conversations with, why should we have a labyrinth? We didn't have detailed plans. We didn't know where it would go or exactly how it would be built, but we started the conversations with, let's do the tactile labyrinth and let's have some reflection in the meetings and let's talk about how we can create that on our campus. And so it was more driven by the idea of what would this add to campus versus how will we get it installed on campus, which for me felt like a different kind of collaborative committee work. So I would say, aside from the takeaways that we discussed of reflective spaces, I think there's a value in practicing reflection while talking to folks about creating reflective spaces, because it gives energy for what you could create on campus or in the city or wherever. There's lots of cities with labyrinths as well. And so we give you the website for our labyrinth, labyrinth.fsu.edu, but then wherever you are, you can check the worldwide labyrinth locator, put in your zip code, and it'll help you find labyrinths around you if you're interested in walking one. And so here is a close-up of the centerpiece that was added in summer 2019 as a sort of focal point when you're in the center of the labyrinth reflecting. And then would love to open it up for folks to either put in the chat or unmute yourself and give us any questions or thoughts or reflections of your own. Thank you, Mitchell. We think it's a cool project too. Laura.
Thank you, Laura.
I have one thought. I know that the two of you haven't necessarily been a part of the summit leading up to this, but some of the discussions that we've had evolve around tactical urbanism. It's kind of this idea of doing less expensive, quick, easy projects to test an idea before you kind of move into something more expensive, more permanent. I think you kind of hit on that with the temporary versus the permanent, or the movable versus the permanent. And I think it's really interesting to see kind of how these reflective spaces could be something like a tactical urbanism equivalent of a project, throw a hammock up, put a seat out here, maybe even, I know, like in New York when they were doing the kind of major changes with the transportation network, they just kind of closed spaces off and put foldable lawn chairs out. But then something can move into something more permanent like this. And I was kind of making that connection that I thought was interesting.
I'll tell you another thing, Artie, and I don't want to forget Mitchell's question that I just saw, but let me respond to your comment. We did a lot of 3D modeling of this. And so many graphic programs now are relatively inexpensive. You don't require an extensive design, but frequently on whether it's a building, whether it's a parking lot, whether it's a garage, whether it's a labyrinth, we did a lot of 3D modeling just to get a sense of scale. Because one of the things that concerned us on this particular project, and this is a good representation, one thing we didn't really focus too much on is with our labyrinth, we wanted to create some sense of enclosure. If you're standing where those sunflowers or where that sculpture is, we didn't want you to feel, or the person to feel overwhelmed. And so what the landscaping is intended to do is to kind of create almost like an umbrella of sorts around that takes down the scale of these very, very large buildings and takes it down to a more human scale. And so when these trees continue to grow, it will almost act as a shield. And even though you're literally within 50 feet of a very busy road, or maybe 100 feet of very busy road, the idea is that you feel that sense of enclosure. Prior to the construction, some of us went out in the middle of that field and we just sat there and try as we could. I mean, we had no idea, or we tried to imagine what it might be to experience that space. And one of the things we came away was just the sheer scale of the building. So whether, like I said, it's a labyrinth or any other kind of improvement, experiencing the space firsthand is critical, as you mentioned, but also even doing the 3D modeling. It can be really simple and it can be very eye-opening. Mitchell's comment was about how much space, and really it can be as much space as you have. I mean, you saw everything from the hand-drawn labyrinth where somebody can go ahead and trace it with their finger on an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper, to the portable labyrinth that Jillian, I guess, is probably about 20 feet square maybe, or something, if even that. What's represented here, I think that area is maybe a little less than an acre. So it's probably about, in this case, anywhere between, I don't know, maybe a half an acre of land. But again, it can be to whatever scale you need it to be, or any scale that you have available. Again, we chose to go a little bit larger because we wanted to provide for those handicapped. And so our pathways are probably twice the size. So we could have perhaps reduced the overall scale of it, but we decided to go ahead and try to fit it to the area that we were building in.
I think the path is a quarter mile to walk the whole thing.
Yeah.
I remember I think it's a quarter mile to walk in and out. So I saw a couple questions. I wasn't sure, Eliza, did you mean like what you can hear when you're in the labyrinth, or the sound relative to the space it's in? And then I saw Deborah's question, in terms of the path, you'll start here. Can you all see the cursor moving? And you go around the perimeter. And then there's 4, I don't know exactly what to call these loops, I guess. And you take each loop in turn, and then you end up in the center. So what you hear while you're walking, that's a good question, Eliza. So right here, you can see at the bottom of the photo, some parking signs. Parking is at a premium at Florida State. And so this is right adjacent to a parking lot, but it's a parking lot that people don't really come in and out of very frequently. It's the medical school and psychology parking lot. And on that fence, you can see at the bottom of the picture, we've started to grow vines. And so sometimes you hear a little traffic noise, but usually when I'm walking this labyrinth, I pop in earbuds and put on some instrumental music. But it's not a heavily trafficked part of campus in terms of obstructive ambient noise. But we did think about creating that sense of enclosure to sort of combat that sense of being exposed. And then Hannah's question, I don't know of any labyrinths in the engineering park or in Panama City, although now that I think about it, you know, it wouldn't be too hard to stake one out with twine and some yardsticks if folks wanted to put up a temporary one.
Can I follow up on Hannah's question too?
Sure.
I'm unaware of even like the reflective spaces at engineering. There is some outdoor space. I don't think there's anything that was designed intentionally. Let me just say that. Obviously, students can find their own reflective space. However, at Panama City, it's very interesting because I did mention this to some of the staff over there on a trip while this was under construction. And they kind of, you know, paused for a minute. And if you're familiar with that campus, and maybe Art, because you asked the question, there's some piers that go out into the bay, and then there's an amphitheater right on the water's edge. And the comment that one of the associate deans made was they couldn't imagine any space that was more reflective or contemplative or more enjoyable than to being right there, not near the water, but literally on the water or next to the water. So it'll be interesting to see as that campus evolves. We're building our first new residence hall there now. And so you have students living there. It'll be interesting to see how the demand for those kinds of experiences grow in the future.
I'm always eager to take a meeting at FSU Panama City because it's right on the water. And it's a nice chance to go see the campus on the water. Well, we appreciate the questions, and if anybody would like to follow up, Artie has contact information for both of us. We always love talking about reflective spaces and how to make sure that we plan for more of them.
Just want to say thank you both for the presentation, and I think a lot of really good discussion, really good questions from it. If anyone does want to follow up, I can provide the contact information for both Jillian and Mark. Just let me know. And I hope everyone will join us at our interactive social hour coming up at 5:45. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.